Hello, White and Case fellows. So once again, we are back at it. This will be the final training video we use, but you're going to use this one all week. So I recommend you pay attention this first time around. And as you're going through and actually editing the cards, you're going to use a bunch of these techniques and use them in this order. So feel free to go back and watch this video, go back to the parts that make the most sense. Okay, so just a quick note before we start. I'm going to ask you to do something you've been told not to do your entire life. So when you're in classes, when you're in school, they tell you do not edit the primary text, right? You can cite sources, you can quote them, what you can even summarize, but you can't write into the actual text itself. We're going to change that today. So today you're going to write into the actual text itself, and you're going to manipulate and change that original text that's in your cards, which you have to do in order to make high quality pieces. So if you remember from our, from our last training, we talked about evidence creation as a process where basically you're sculpting the arguments and ideas for these students. So the metaphor we used last time is that you're the one that mines the materials. That's getting the actual research and evidence and putting it together in, subtopics and what have you. You're the one that works that vision into the form. So if your vision is, well, the AF should be saying this and the neg should be saying this, you're the one that's actually working it into that form by choosing the arguments, choosing the cards, doing the phrasing, doing the underlining, doing all that stuff that's going to lead students to making particular arguments in particular ways, right? At the end of all this, you're the sculptor, you're the architect who creates these ideas, creates the packet, creates the balance, creates everything in here. So I'm going to teach you some tools and techniques to get the right sculpture that you want at the end of this, and hopefully you'll feel pretty good about it. Before we get into the actual techniques itself, I want to make sure to be clear and note that the goal of editing is not to make this job easier. The goal of editing is to make the evidence more robust and accessible. So we want to take out all the stuff, we want to filter out all the stuff that makes the evidence not robust or not accessible or too long or too convoluted. Get that out of here, right? But we're also going to add in parts that help smooth out some of the mistakes or some of the pieces that the author left out, or we don't think that they argued particularly well, right? So we're going to remove some parts and we're going to add some parts, not to make this an easier process, but just to make the arguments better overall. So if you remember last time we talked about some quick measurement standards to know if we're doing a good job creating the evidence packet. So I want to go back to those real quick. Keep these in mind as you're going through and editing. These are sort of the guiding focus of what we're doing with the evidence packet itself, and the tools only exist to get these goals or these results in the cards, right? So the first main area is accessibility, definitely the most important one for evidence packet creation. As part of accessibility, we're thinking through things like, what is the reading level? What is the word count? Is the formatting standardized and accessible, which verbatim will largely do for us? And then, are the concepts chunked? Are things put together in a way that students can read it and naturally understand it, right? Second big area of accessibility or measurement standards is rigor. Rigor, we're going to use reading level again. We're going to use argument completeness. So we're thinking about, like, is there a claim? Is there data that supports that claim? And then are there warrants that explain how that data supports that claim, right? That's a complete argument. We're going to look at source quality. Source quality matters for when you're creating the citations, which I emailed you about last week. And then the type of data and warrant. So if we're saying, well, the affirmative has statistics, data, historical examples, expert citations, all that good stuff, right? And the negative just has examples. That's not very balanced, right? And that's not very rigorous. So we want to make sure both sides have the right types of data and warrant to support all of their evidence and have a variety, not necessarily in every card, but as a whole in the aggregate, right? And then finally is balance. So balance, we're going to think about complexity, right? both sides should be equally complex, whether that's high complexity or low complexity, ideally kind of a middle complexity, something that like an eighth or ninth grader will understand. We're going to talk about amount or strength of evidence. So the same number of cards on each side and having them be relatively strong versus each other and relatively similar. We're going to talk about argument mirroring. So if the affirmative says the US economy is going to be really strong in the next 5 years, the negative has to have some answer to that. Ideally, it should say, no, the US economy is going to be weak in the next 5 years, right? We want them to match up exactly and disagree with each other in similar ways. And then finally, a mix of offense and defense for each subtopic. So each subtopic, they should have arguments about why their side is right and arguments about why the other side is wrong. We're going to get all that. I'm going to try to get all that. The basic idea is that over the course of the season, the debaters are going to kind of dig into the evidence. First day, they're not really going to know what the evidence says. They're just going to know the big story, right? So they're going to know like, well, the affirmative thinks that, you know, if we pass the affirmative, it'll help the economy. Okay, great. That's the story. That's all they need to know at that point, right? But as they start going to more tournaments, more practices, they're going to get deeper into the evidence. They're going to start understanding it on a tag level, right? So they'll know like, hey, my affirmative, my advantage has 3 parts. There's uniqueness, solvency, and impact. I know the tag for each of those parts. You know, maybe the uniqueness tag says something like, right now, the US economy is weak. And then the solvency tag says, but if we pass the plan, the economy will be strong. Then the impact tag says, when the economy is strong, good things happen. Now they're a little deeper into the story. They kind of understand the individual parts. They know how they work together, right? Then they keep digging down, hopefully throughout the season, and they'll get more and more into the individual data itself in the cards. So in the cards themselves, the data is things like quotes, data, stats, the citation quality of each card. And those are going to really help the debaters get into those later parts of the season and say, well, my story is true because my uniqueness says the US economy will be weak, and my card has statistics, it has historical data, it's from a great source, it's much better than the negatives argument because theirs doesn't have good sources, or it's not historically true, or their author is not qualified, or something like that, right? This is where the actual in-depth debating happens. But we need to design the packet so that they have the opportunity to continue to dig deeper and deeper and deeper over time, but also that the packet makes sense on first reading without all of that additional context and layering to it. Okay, so let's actually talk about the tools for editing. And I recommend doing these in order as listed for each card. So each time you get to a new card, reset right from the top and do these in order, I would recommend. First one is to cut out unnecessary chunks of text. We're just going to delete, 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 right? This is good because if you cut long-ish cards and we're trying to get each card down to about 1 page, you must delete, right? You must delete. So don't worry. You can always cut more out as we do these other steps, but right off the bat, we want to cut out everything that's not necessary so that we don't waste time editing it and trying to fix it later. So how do you know what's unnecessary? The unnecessary things are the things that don't support the tag of the card. The tag is, if you have a good tag for your card, that should be the claim. So if you're saying the US economy will be, growth will be low over the next 5 years, anything that doesn't support that claim doesn't belong in the card. Cut it out. So the things you want would be like the data, the quotes, the statistics that do support that. You could even keep in some contextual pieces, like explaining acronyms, explaining concepts. Like for that, you might want to explain like, hey, what is GDP? GDP is like the US economy's report card every quarter. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it up? Is it down? Whatever, right? And some context for the arguments. For cutting, don't overdo it right off the bat. Anything that seems like it should be cut, just cut it out. And then as we work through this process, if there's more you need to cut, we'll cut more. Don't worry about it. Okay, second step, create shorter sentences. So we don't have to fully rewrite the sentences here. We can just change some of the punctuation to reduce the sentences. And remember when we talked about chunking and about word count? This really helps with chunking and word count because if there's fewer words per sentence, it's easier to read psychologically. And when we get to the next step, having shorter sentences is going to be really helpful also. So if you see these types of punctuation I have on the left, a lot of the time you can just replace these with a period. You might need to add some transitionary words like, but where you normally have a paragraph break or comma or something, you might have to add in there like, oh, therefore, or but, or however, or something like that to like move on to the next sentence. But it's better to have that than it is to have long run-on sentences because long run-on sentences require a lot of brain power to remember what's going on in the sentence and where it's going, right? Okay, so now you've made some shorter sentences. Now we move to the next step, which is shorter paragraphs. So we want to really shoot for about 3 to 5 sentences per paragraph, and each sentence to be about 10 to 15 words long. So each paragraph itself should be about 50 or fewer words, right? 50 or fewer is enough that a kid can read it, have a couple sentences, and understand what that chunk is about. So, for example, let me show you a piece of evidence in here, right? This is from the middle school packet we'll be using next year. This card's a little long. It's the 4th uniqueness card, so it's kind of the biggest one in there. So you can see there's a couple paragraphs in here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 paragraphs, right? One of them's pretty long. One of them's pretty short. It's only 2 sentences. And then there's 3 paragraphs that are 3 separate points, and then 1 connective paragraph at the end. So this is pretty much the minimal underlining you could have for this. The underlining up here just sort of explains the concept and explains some major points. And then you have a transition paragraph, 2 sentences, and then 1 paragraph per, sorry, 1 sentence per paragraph that sort of explains what the paragraph is. So kids will read this one time through, they'll get the concept. Later on, they'll be asked to defend this evidence in debates, and they're going to have to look through each of these paragraphs and really say like, okay, here's what this is saying. Here's why this is important. Here's why this matters, right? So those paragraphs are broken into conceptual chunks, right? Each paragraph is its own chunk. First one explains what the concept is. Second one is transition from first paragraph to the next 3 paragraphs. And then each paragraph beyond that is one of the main points. So that's what chunking looks like. Your paragraphs should absolutely look like that. Anytime you have a new concept or a new idea, or the vibe of what you're saying changes a little bit, like maybe you go from argument to making explanation, create a new paragraph, new vibe, new chunk, right? Feel free to add breaks to existing paragraphs and cut unnecessary sentences. As you go through this process, you might realize some of those sentences you created, the shorter ones, don't really fit or they don't really make sense. Cut them out. Okay, next one is kind of a 2-for-1 deal. This is synonyms and vocab. So as you go through your evidence, there's going to be some difficult words in there. That's fine. The 2 options you have to deal with those difficult words are either to choose simple synonyms for that word. So if you have a really long, difficult, ACT college level word, you can just change that word to a simpler word, or an adjective plus a simple word, right? That's fine. That's totally fine. That's going to save you a lot of time, space, reduce the complexity of what you're talking about. You can also take multiple similar words and choose 1 synonym for them all. This is going to run against how you normally think to do things. Most people are taught to write, and instead of using the same word over and over, you're supposed to use a bunch of synonyms to make it sound more varied and more verbose and have more variety. That's fine in that type of writing. Not very good for this type of writing, right? So for the most part, those difficult words, we want to change them to one or two synonyms that are similar, but smaller, more compact, and more simple, right? And you can also delete unnecessary adjectives and adverbs from your synonyms. Instead of saying something was very cool, you can just say it was cool, right? Or instead of saying something was extraordinarily exquisite, you could just say it was very nice. I'm not saying you need to cut it down fully to the bone, but you do want to make some cuts that make it a little more streamlined and straightforward, right? The second thing you can do is make those synonyms into vocabulary words. So sometimes you have to use a big or difficult word. There's simply no way to make the argument without using that word. That's okay. You just make it a vocab word. All right. So make it a vocab word, and then at the bottom of the page, put the word and a little definition of what it means so that kids can see, like, ah, okay, I didn't know what exquisite meant. Now I see down below it means very fine, nice, refined. I understand what it is, right? So that's how you can do it. And you can also take multiple different words that mean roughly the same thing and turn them into one vocab word. So for example, is there a last year or a year before Puerto Rico or Cuba topic for Debate en Español? There's a lot of arguments, a lot of authors that talk about things like capitalism, imperialism, colonialism. All those concepts were kind of wrapped up into the same idea. So we just changed all of them to one word and then made that word a vocab word, right? So it changes the meaning a little bit, but for students who are in the debate or who are just sort of using it casually, it's not going to be that much of a difference. Okay. So this is going to make it way easier to read and way easier to conceptually understand, but not change the meaning very much. So feel free to do that. That's all right. Okay. Okay. Next thing you can do is import chunks of text from other pieces, cards that you've cut that you're not going to use, right? So it happens to me all the time where, I'll cut like 30 cards, but I'm only going to use 5 of them. And of those 25 I'm cutting, or I'm leaving behind, there's like some good quotes or stats or explanations that I really wish I could have used. For something like this, where we can do editing, you can just take those quotes or those statistics and port them over to a card that you're going to use and could use a little more juice to it, right? So even if there's cards you're not going to use, find the nice pieces of them and feel free to bring them over to existing pieces of evidence. And obviously edit them down in the way that we've done already. But this can help fill out your cards, add more context, reduce the word count, and improve the quality of the complexity and context to the arguments, right? Especially quotes, data, and explanations of concepts. Okay, next one is formatting. This is really easy because verbatim is going to take care of most of this for you. But anything that is not a verbatim macro, you need to remove the extra formatting, right? So if you're copy pasting evidence and it has bolding or italics or underlining or hyperlinks in it, get rid of it. Get rid of it. Make it normal text. Get rid of those hyperlinks so that when you use verbatim, it standardizes and normalizes the text. Okay. That's really important for accessibility because we don't want words that are bolded or underlined or whatever unless we want them that way. So unless you're using a verbatim macro to make it that way, they shouldn't look that way by the time you get done with this, right? Okay. I believe this is finally, but final step is to add what I call connective tissue if necessary. So as you've gotten through this process, you've probably done a lot of cutting and you've really cut these cards down to the bone and made them very simple and straightforward. That's good. Now it's time to add a little bit to jazz them up and make them sort of fleshed out. So if all that cutting is cut things down to the bone, this is the fleshing out process to sort of make the connections, add the context, add examples as necessary, and sort of beef up the cards a little bit to make them higher quality. So Whereas before we've been cutting down, 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 down. Now you can add a little bit up to sort of make it make a little more sense. Okay. Don't go too wild here. You got to remember this is the author's argument and their card. So you don't want to add or subtract too much that changes the meaning of what they're talking about. But for the sake of, you know, making it more accessible, making it more rigorous, it's okay to add a little bit and add your own words here and there to make it work. Final note, one of the checks before we put this into the tools that we're going to talk about for measuring accessibility is card length. So each card should be no longer than 1 page. So you remember where I told you to open Microsoft Word and put it in print view so you can see where the actual page cutoffs are? None of these cards should be longer than a page because we're going to physically print these out and we don't want them to run over pages, right? So some cards do need to be the full 1 page long, like they're complicated, they have complex ideas, there's some explanation in them, whatever, right? That's fine. Most of them don't. Most of them can be 2, maybe 3 paragraphs, pretty simple, forward, straight to the point. And keep in mind that card length should match on the AF and neg. So if the AF has a bunch of long cards, the neg should have long cards. AF has short cards, neg should have short cards. Ideally, both sides have a variety of both. So if kids want to make a quick argument, they can use a short card. But if they really want to stake their claim on that argument, they can use a long card that's a little more stronger and in-depth. So keep it varied, right? Okay, after you've done all that, then you move to a double check. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to send you the tools you're going to use for the double check. But basically, you just copy all the text, not including the tag or citation, just the card text, put it in there, hit the button, and it's going to show you basically the rough idea of what the reading level is. And there's usually a couple different measurements that it uses to find reading level. So just kind of look through them and get a sense of like, well, where is this at? Is it mostly 7th, 8th, 9th? What is it mostly like? If it's mostly 10s with 1 or 2 7s, it's probably still too high, right? If it's mostly 7s with 1 or 2 10s, that's probably fine. You can move on. The baseline I want you to work towards is try to get each card at least to 9th grade reading level, but 7th would be better. If you can get down to 7th grade reading level, that's perfect. If you get the results back and it's 10th grade reading level or higher, you probably have to go back and reuse some of the tools above to get it where you want it, right? Okay. Now that you've gotten it, you've done the double check, you've gotten it to 9th grade or below, ideally 7th grade. Now you can actually underline the card. So to underline the card, I want you to start by underlining the bare minimum. Look at the tag and look at the card and see what data or claims in the card actually directly support this argument, this claim in the tag. If there's something in the card that doesn't directly support that claim, you don't need to highlight it, right? For most cards, we want to highlight about 1/3 of the evidence text. Half is probably okay also if each card is about a page long. But 1/3 is good. So I want you to start with the minimum. That's probably going to be 1, 2, 3 sentences. Maybe add a little bit more than that, underline a little bit more, but keep working your way up, underline more and more and more, the necessary stuff until you get about to 1/3. Or if you feel like you need more to explain the concept to make the argument, about half. If you're underlining more than half, you probably didn't do a good job editing. You probably have too much stuff in there. You're trying to cram too much stuff into the card. As NASA administrator said, trying to fit 10 pounds of potatoes into a 5-pound sack, okay? Put 5 pounds of potatoes into a 5-pound sack. If you need 2 sacks for 10 pounds, that's fine. Make 2 cards. Sometimes that's what you have to do. I should have added that as another point. Sometimes you have to make 2 cards out of 1. Split them in half, have 2 different concepts, and just write them out that way, right? Okay. Okay. Final thought is to think in the aggregate. you don't need to stress over every word and every sentence and every paragraph meeting these standards, but everything should balance out on the whole. And if you use these tools above, by the end of Friday, we're going to get to an evidence packet that is more or less balanced between the two, right? So, both sides should have about equal, they should have exactly the equal number amount of cards. They should have relatively equal strength in each subtopic. And the amount of evidence, like the length and conceptual difficulty of the cards, should be about the same for each side. That being said, the one thing I want to caution you against is don't fall into a pattern of a certain writing style. It's really easy to be like, hey, I noticed the 5-paragraph essay works, so I'm just going to write every card that way. Don't do that. Variety is the spice of life. Some cards should have quotes, some cards should have stats. Some cards should be long, some cards should be short. Some cards should be really directly to the point. Some cards should be more conceptual and contextual, right? Let it be varied. Let there be different types of arguments and different ways of thinking about the evidence. Kids come from different places to these arguments and to this information, and they're going to latch on to these ideas differently. So give them a lot of different places, a lot of different grappling hooks for how they can actually attach to these evidence and arguments. Okay. All right. Everything you need other than this is going to be in the email. So enjoy. And thank you so much for all your work. I think you all are going to produce really excellent content, and I'm very excited to see the final product.